One day, in 1989, a group of tourists was on a yacht cruise when suddenly they spotted something floating in the water. As they got closer, they realized it was a woman's body. They called the police, and after searching the area, they found 3 bodies of women in the same location. The victims' legs were tied with rope, which was connected to a concrete block. It took a long time to find the criminal, but in the end, the police discovered him in a very strange and unique way, unlike anything I've seen before, and I think it might be the first of its kind. This story is very exciting, so stick around till the end, as it has many surprises. Hi, it's Shamsuddin here. Before we dive into today's story, I want to give a quick warning. This story involves a crime, and also includes the topic of assault on women. I think you understand what I mean by assault. I won't go deep into this part, but there are some things that are necessary to mention in order to understand the story. In the end, this is a true story, so if anyone feels uncomfortable hearing such things, it might be better to skip this video. The story goes back to 1989, so it's a bit of an old case. The events took place in the state of Florida, which is basically a peninsula surrounded by water on all sides, so it attracts a lot of tourists all year round. Most of these tourists gather around the coastal areas, and in one of these areas there was a city called Tampa. A group of tourists was on a yacht, enjoying the atmosphere, when all of a sudden they saw something strange floating in the water. As they got closer, they were shocked to see that it was a dead woman's body. The Coast Guard was immediately notified. The body wasn't far from the shore, maybe around 3 kilometers, so the Coast Guard arrived and retrieved the woman's body. They were surprised to find that her mouth was taped shut with duct tape, her hands were tied with a yellow rope, and even worse, her legs were bound to a concrete block, meaning someone had deliberately tied her up and thrown her into the sea. The procedure in such cases is for the Coast Guard to search the area for any evidence or anything that might be related to the crime. While searching the area, they found 2 more women's bodies, both in the same condition. Their mouths were taped, their hands tied, and their legs bound to concrete blocks. This meant there were 3 victims involved. The first thing the police noticed was that all 3 victims had their lower clothing removed, so they assumed they had been assaulted before being thrown into the sea. Even worse, their lungs were full of water, which meant they drowned while still alive. They weren't thrown into the sea after being killed, they were deliberately drowned underwater. The killer made sure to attach the concrete blocks to ensure they sank. This wasn't just a murder, it was more like an execution. On top of that, their eyes weren't covered, meaning each one saw the others being thrown into the sea, as if the killer was getting some kind of sick pleasure from adding more psychological pain to their suffering. You might be wondering, how did the bodies float to the surface, even though they were tied to concrete blocks? The answer is that after death, the body starts to decompose, releasing gases inside, causing the body to bloat like a balloon, which makes it float to the surface. Even the heavy block wasn't enough to keep them underwater. But when they were alive, the weight of the block was more than enough to drag them down. The second thing the police noticed was that the 3 victims looked alike, so they concluded that they were probably related, and most likely it was a mother and her daughters. One of the victims was older, while the other 2 were teenage girls. None of their bodies or belongings had any IDs or papers to identify them. So the police's next job was to figure out who they were. They had no choice but to put the case out to the media. Of course, they didn't release any pictures of the victims or their bodies, since the bodies were already starting to decompose, but they announced that they'd found 3 bodies, an older woman and 2 teenage girls, who were believed to be her daughters. They asked anyone with information to come forward and contact them. It didn't take long before the police got a call from the manager of a local hotel called Days Inn. The manager told the investigators that they had some guests, a woman and her 2 daughters, who had checked in, but no one had seen them in 3 days. When the cleaning staff entered their room, they found all their belongings still there, like they had just disappeared out of nowhere. The police asked, why didn't the hotel try to contact them? Remember, this was 1989. Back then, cell phones weren't really common. They existed, but not many people used them, and they weren't practical or had good coverage. Anyway, the police went to the hotel and were able to identify the woman and her daughters. The mom's name was Joan Rogers. Her oldest daughter was named Michelle, who was 17 years old, and her younger daughter was named Christy, who was 14. After identifying them, the police found out they were from a different state, Ohio, which is over 1,500 kilometers from Florida. It was clear they were on a vacation. The question was, why were they alone? The investigators managed to get in touch with the father Joan's husband named Hal Rogers. Here's a picture of the family together, but it's old, taken years before the incident, back when the girls were younger. Hal and his family ran a dairy farm in Ohio, which had chickens and cows. Running that farm was exhausting work that required constant attention all year long, no breaks. There was no time off unless someone could take over for you. The animals needed daily care. When Joan and the girls wanted to take a vacation and get away for a bit, Hal didn't have the chance to join them because the farm needed someone to stay and take care of it. Plus, their financial situation and the farm's income weren't enough for them to hire help, so he could never leave the farm. That's why Joan and the girls went on the trip by themselves. Hal's behavior was really strange. It wasn't normal for him to let them go on such a long trip all alone. They were supposed to come back on June 1st, which was the agreed-upon date. But one day passed, then 2, then 3, and they didn't return. Here's where it gets odd. Hal didn't even try to contact the police. Like, if you were a dad or anyone in his position and your family was on a trip with a set return date and they didn't come back on time, you'd start to worry, right? Most likely, you'd go straight to the police the very next day. But this dad didn't care at all. 3 days passed, and he didn't do a thing. In the end, it was the police who reached out to him to let him know what happened. The investigators were surprised by him. He seemed so cold, especially after they told him the news. His response was, "I don't have time to be emotional right now. I've got a farm to run." And he went back to working on the farm like nothing happened.
He seemed somewhat cold to me, very cold. Here's a person who's just lost his entire family. Not just one, but 3 people. And there was no emotion.
Hal told police he didn't have time to be emotional. He had a farm to run.
Honestly, it's unbelievable. This was the first time I've ever seen a father so cold. How do you not feel sad, even a little after your wife and daughters were murdered in such a horrific way? Let's assume, for argument's sake, that he had issues with his wife and didn't love her anymore. Fine. But what about your daughters? Your little girl's 17 and the other 14? Some criminal kidnapped them, did whatever he did to them, then killed them like that and tossed them into the ocean while they were still alive. Don't you feel sad for them, even a little? The investigators immediately became suspicious of him. I mean, in family crimes, the relatives are always the first suspects. And even you, right now, probably think he's the killer. But after looking into him more, the investigators were sure that he had nothing to do with the crime, and he hadn't even left town in the past few days. First off, the town they lived in is in Ohio, which is more than 1,500 kilometers from Florida, where the crime happened. For him to go and come back, it'd take at least 2 days. Plus, the town he lives in is tiny, with only a few hundred people, and everyone knows each other. The dad would go to eat at the local diner every day because He couldn't cook for himself. His wife, Joan, always cooked for him. People saw him every day, and there were multiple witnesses who confirmed they saw him at the diner supermarket or around town every single day. So, there's no way the dad was the killer. But the strange thing is, his cold reaction, like he didn't show any emotion and went straight back to working on the farm as if nothing happened. Some psychologists say that maybe this was his way of coping with grief and pain, like he was trying to drown himself in work and his daily routine to forget, because the shock was too much for him to process. But even now, when he appears in interviews, you get the sense that he talks about it in a really cold way, and sometimes it even seems like he's smiling when he tells the story. Anyway, moving away from the dad, let's get back to the crime. The forensic experts examined the bodies for any clues, but unfortunately, any evidence that could have been there, whether fingerprints, hair, or DNA, was all washed away by the water. The bodies had been in the water for 3 days, which was more than enough time to erase everything. The police were looking for the mom's car at the time because they knew she had a car. After searching, they found it at a small dock on the coast, so they figured the mom and her daughters probably got on a boat from that dock. The boat likely belonged to the killer. This dock was small and public, not even really called a dock, more like a launch point for boats. Meaning boats didn't stay parked there, they'd just come by for a short time, pick up passengers, and leave right away. Anyone with a boat could use it, and there was no registration or membership required. It was a public place. Anyway, they found the mom's car parked in front of this small dock, so the police started searching it. Now, I want you to pay close attention here. The police found some important things in the car. They discovered 2 handwritten notes, and each note was written in a different handwriting, meaning 2 different people had written on them. The first note was like a map or directions with handwritten instructions to the location of the hotel where they were staying. The second note had directions to the dock, the one where the car was parked in front of. Of course, the investigators took both notes to forensic handwriting experts for analysis. The note with directions to the dock was written by the mom. The experts had samples of her handwriting and confirmed after comparison that it was hers. But the second note, which was a map with directions to the hotel, was written by an unknown person. The handwriting was unique. For example, in the word Courtney that you see in front of you, the T in the middle of the word was written as a capital letter, which is odd because capital letters usually go at the start of a word. Writing a capital letter in the middle of a word is strange. Also, the letter Y was written in a peculiar way. There were 4 wide Ys in the writing, and each one was written differently from the others in a distinct and noticeable way. So the unknown person who wrote the hotel directions had very unique handwriting. The police focused all their attention on these 2 notes because they felt they might lead them to the killer. In any case, these notes were the only clue they had. Now, let's go back to the first note, the one written by the mom with directions to the dock where they found the car. The last 2 words on this note were blue and white. Okay, if they were heading to a dock or a boat launch, what could be blue and white? It's pretty obvious it would be a boat. The investigators quickly figured out that this must be the color of the boat, so they started gathering some information. Then the police got a tip from someone. This person told them there was a man who lived in the area and was running an unlicensed business using that dock or boat launch. His business was taking tourists on sunset cruises. This man's name was Jason Wilcox, and he had a boat that was blue and white. After looking into him and his background, the police were shocked to find that he had a criminal record and had previously been arrested for assault. When they checked his address, they found out he lived about 8 kilometers from the small dock. So the police went to his house, and they were surprised to find the boat in his yard. and next to the boat were pieces of concrete blocks, just like the ones that were tied to the victims' bodies. Jason, of course, denied any involvement in the crime, and without solid physical evidence against him, the police couldn't do much. They couldn't even ask him for a handwriting sample to compare it to the unknown handwriting on the note. But the investigators kept watching him and following up, and during their investigation, a new lead came up. Naturally, the case became well known, and pictures of the victims were posted in the media, even on big billboards in the streets. They offered a $25,000 reward for any information leading to the resolution of the case. Every day, the police were getting a large number of calls and tips from people. Most of them, of course, weren't useful and didn't lead anywhere. But one person came forward with something important. This person was actually a Canadian tourist named Judy Blair, who had also been on a trip to Florida. Her picture wasn't released in the media. This Canadian woman filed a report with the police about an assault that happened to her on a boat. The assault took place just 2 weeks before Joan and her daughters were murdered. She said she had been visiting Florida with a friend, and one day while they were walking around, a man approached them and started talking. He seemed nice and told them he ran a small business offering sunset boat tours. Her friend declined, saying, "No, thank you." But Judy was tempted by the idea of a boat ride at sunset. It seemed like something not to be missed. And of course, a sunset from the middle of the ocean would be a beautiful and special scene. But you're in a foreign country? How do you go out alone on a boat in the middle of the ocean with a stranger? Why? Some people are just too trusting, and maybe things were different back then. This was before the internet age, and people didn't always hear about criminals and crime stories. In any case, the Canadian woman got on the boat with the stranger, and when they were out in the ocean alone with no one around, the man pulled out a knife, put it to her throat, and threatened her. If she didn't let him do what he wanted, he'd kill her. The man planned to assault her and even warned her, "Don't even think about jumping into the water to swim away. The sea's full of sharks." She started begging and pleading for him to let her go. Eventually, the terrible assault happened, and after that she sat in the corner of the boat covering her face, while the man waited until it got dark. Then he started the boat again and headed back to shore. When they got close to the shore, he ordered her to jump into the water and swim to shore. Investigators believe he did this to remove any evidence tied to him, so any fingerprints, hair, or DNA would be washed away. She didn't go straight to the police afterward, but instead returned to her hotel, took a shower, and then went to the police. By then, any evidence of the assault was gone, and there was no DNA they could trace. When she finally went to the police, they couldn't do anything for her because she didn't have much information about the man. The only thing she could provide was his appearance, and a sketch was drawn of the suspect. After the police opened the investigation into this woman's case, just 2 weeks later, the murder of Joan and her daughters happened. The news mentioned that the boat in the murder was blue and white, the same colors as the boat involved in the Canadian woman's assault. So, she went back to the police and told them, "I'm sure the killer in this case is the same man who attacked me." And the investigators were already convinced that the man responsible for both crimes was the same person. Now, the Canadian woman became the main witness in the case because she was the only person who had seen the man's face. The first thing the investigators did was show her a photo of Jason Wilcox, the person they had been suspicious of. But when she saw the picture, she said, "No, this isn't the man who attacked me." Even when they compared his appearance to the police sketch, the features didn't match. In the end, they brought Jason in for a polygraph test, and he passed. He also had an alibi with witnesses confirming they were with him on the day of the murder. So Jason Wilcox was cleared of both charges. As for the sketch of the suspect, It led to a lot of calls from people who thought they had seen him or knew who he was. The same thing happened with the blue and white boat. A lot of calls came in because many boats were blue and white. In other words, the police had a huge number of reports to sift through and investigate. But in the end, they found out that one of those tips was correct. The criminal's neighbor recognized him from the sketch and called the police, telling them his suspicions, but it's unclear what happened next. It seems like the police either didn't check him out thoroughly or investigated quickly and ruled him out, even though he was the actual killer. Can you imagine? They got a correct tip, but it didn't lead to his arrest. Maybe the overwhelming number of daily tips led to this mistake. Even though the killer was right under their noses, he remained free. This went on for 3 years, and the case remained unsolved. Now we're in 1992, and the case was still open, but it didn't have the same momentum it did at the beginning, and they weren't working on it as intensely. Even so, tips kept coming in. One of the detectives working the case had a strange but clever idea. You remember the note they found in the mom's car? The one that had directions to the hotel written in that unique handwriting? The police believed the killer had written that note, and since the handwriting was so distinctive, there was a chance someone might recognize it. So what did the police do? They put up 5 big billboards around town with a blown-up image of the killer's handwriting. Next to it, they wrote, "Who wrote these directions?" You could identify the killer of the Rogers family. $25,000 reward. At the bottom, they included the police department's phone number. This was a bold and unusual move. I don't think anyone had ever tried something like this to solve a crime before. It was a first-of-its-kind tactic, putting a criminal's handwriting on billboards. And believe it or not, it worked. This woman you see here, her name is Joanna Stewie. And notice the strange coincidence, her name is almost the same as the murdered mother's name, and she's the one who helped solve the case. One day, Joanna was walking down the street and saw one of the billboards with the killer's handwriting. As soon as she saw it, she recognized the handwriting because it was so unique. She immediately called the police and said, "This handwriting looks just like a contractor who worked at my house before. I have invoices from him with the same handwriting. You guys need to come check it out." The detectives went to her, and she told them she had dealt with a contractor who worked in aluminum installation. He had done some work at her house and gave her invoices with his handwriting, and she was sure the handwriting on the invoices looked just like the writing on the billboard. She also said the man's personality was strange. He talked in a creepy way and always seemed to be lying. Her experience with him had been bad. The detectives took the invoices from her and sent them to a forensic handwriting expert. With just a quick look, the expert knew the handwriting was a perfect match. She noticed that the T, in many words, was written in uppercase in the middle of the word, just like on the note. She also found the same weird variations in the way the letter Y was written. There was no doubt the person who wrote the invoice was the same person who wrote the directions to the hotel. The police went straight to him and arrested him. And if there had been any doubt before, it disappeared when the police compared his photo to the sketch. The resemblance was spot on. The killer's name was Oba Chandler. He was 43 at the time and married. Can you believe this guy had 8 children with 7 different women and owned an aluminum contracting business where he installed doors, kitchens, and other aluminum-related home fixtures? He also had a criminal record going back to his teenage years, including 2 assaults on women, and had spent time in jail for that. On top of all that, he owned a blue and white boat. One of the strongest pieces of evidence the police got was from the boat's communication records. These records track radio calls made from any boat in the area to the shore, since those calls go through the Coast Guard or a boat communication center. The records confirmed that his boat was out at sea when the crime was committed because it turns out the killer called his wife after the murders, telling her there were problems with the boat and that he'd be late coming home. Oba Chandler, of course, denied the charges, saying he was innocent. But after the police arrested him, they brought in their key witness, the Canadian girl he attacked on the boat. They showed her his picture among a set of other photos, not just his alone, to make sure she could identify him for real. Without hesitation, she pointed to his picture and said, "That's him, I'm sure." And you could see the fear and disgust all over her face. To be even more certain, they brought Oba Chandler in and had him stand in a lineup with other men so the witness could identify him in person. Same thing, she quickly pointed him out, without any doubt confirming that he was the one who attacked her. After that, the detectives decided to search Chandler's boat, but they were surprised to find out he had sold it just 3 months after committing the crime, likely to get rid of any potential evidence. The investigators still needed more evidence to strengthen their case in court. They had the note with the directions to the hotel, and after examining it, they found several fingerprints. Most of the prints belonged to the victims, the mom and her daughters, but there was a large handprint on the note as well. We're not just talking about fingerprints, but the whole palm print. It looked like, while writing the directions, he had his palm pressed on the paper. When they compared that palm print to Oba Chandler's, it was a perfect match. With the handwriting confirmed to be his, and the palm print as undeniable evidence, the detectives felt like they didn't need anything more. Chandler was brought to trial in front of the judge and jury, and the prosecutor presented all the evidence against him. Chandler kept claiming he was innocent, but the handwriting and palm print on the note were too strong. In a desperate attempt to explain himself and wriggle out of the evidence, Chandler made up a new story. He said that the real story was that he met Jo and her daughters at a gas station, and the mom looked lost and confused, not knowing where to go, so she asked him for help. He claimed he then took the map, wrote directions to the hotel, and that was the extent of his interaction with them. The detectives didn't buy this story. They knew he wasn't telling the whole truth. They believed that after giving the mom directions to the hotel, he probably kept chatting with her, trying to come across as a nice, helpful guy. Maybe after that, he offered to take them on a sunset boat ride, and the young girls, excited by the idea, convinced their mom to go. The mom likely wrote down directions to the marina Chandler gave her and even noted the important detail, blue and white, referring to the color of his boat. Afterward, Chandler must have told the mom to meet him at the marina an hour before sunset. That day, they showed up at the agreed-upon time and got on the boat with him. Then, he started moving, and most likely when they got to the middle of the sea far from the coast and away from anyone else, this criminal pulled out a knife and started threatening them. And of course, in such an isolated place, with no way to escape, they had no choice but to comply. The criminal grabbed them and tied them up with the yellow rope we talked about earlier, and then most likely assaulted them. And when he was done, he tied their feet to cement blocks and threw them into the sea while they were still alive. He didn't even think about killing them first. He just threw them in alive and let them drown. He didn't even bother to blindfold them. The last one he threw in was probably the mother who watched her daughters drown right in front of her eyes. So why did this criminal get rid of them in such a brutal way? The answer came from one of the witnesses presented by the prosecutor in court. This witness was an inmate and a cellmate of Oba Chandler after he got arrested. And it's known that prisoners talk to each other, and it seems like Oba felt comfortable around the other inmates who were all criminals like him. So he started talking about his crimes, bragging that once he assaulted a foreign woman on a boat in the middle of the sea. He was talking about the Canadian girl. And another time, he told his cellmate that he assaulted 2 women and their mother in the middle of the sea, and that he wouldn't have been in jail if one of the girls hadn't tried to fight back. This testimony was provided by his cellmate, who said the reason Oba Chandler killed the mother and her daughters was because one of them resisted. Maybe if she hadn't resisted, he would have let them go like the Canadian girl. His cellmate's testimony was added to the evidence against him, and there were other witnesses who came forward to testify in court, including one of Oba's daughters and her husband, who said that Oba once showed up at their house unexpectedly and confessed to them about the crime. He said he was trying to hide from the police because they were looking for him. And of course, not only did Oba sell his boat after the crime, but he also moved out of his house and took his family to another area because the news about the crime was spreading and the picture showing his facial features was all over the place. After the prosecutor presented the evidence he had and the jury listened to the witnesses' testimonies, it took them only an hour and a half to deliberate before they quickly found him guilty. Based on that, the judge ruled that Oba Chandler was guilty and sentenced him to death. Yes, Florida is one of the American states that still has the death penalty, and it hasn't been abolished to this day. But Oba Chandler stayed in prison for many years before the execution was carried out. I'm not exactly sure, but it seems like death penalty cases take a long time, maybe to ensure the person is truly guilty, or to make sure no new evidence comes out that proves them innocent, especially since Oba never confessed to the crime and kept insisting on his innocence. So the execution was delayed for many years, and in addition, Florida was going through changes in execution methods. They used to carry out executions by electric chair, but the electric chair was abolished in the year 2000, which caused even more delays in carrying out the death sentence. Finally, after all those years, the date for his execution was set for November 15, 2011. And the method was by lethal injection. And on the day of the execution, Oba wrote a letter saying, "You're executing an innocent man today," meaning even up until that moment he was still claiming innocence. But that letter and those extra words didn't help him, and the death sentence was carried out. Surprisingly, Oba Chandler's crimes didn't stop there. You might be wondering, how wasn't he executed? Yes, he was executed, but 4 years after his execution in 2015, it was discovered that he was a serial killer. There was an unsolved case of a girl who was murdered in 1990. She was only 20 years old when her body was found dumped on the side of a road after she was assaulted. Finally, in 2015, after major advances in forensic science and DNA analysis, they reviewed the case and reopened it. They were able to match the DNA found on her body to Oba Chandler's, confirming he was her killer. This shows that this criminal was a serial killer, and only God knows if he was connected to other unsolved cases that remain to this day. But at least justice was served, and he was executed. And with that, we've reached the end of our story. And if you've made it to this moment and haven't given a like, I'm not mad at you. God will forgive you. But if you want me to forgive you, I'm not going to be mad. Just be happy, my dear viewer. And if you want to help me out, check out these amazing videos. If you haven't seen them before, trust me, you'll enjoy them. See you in the next video. Peace out.